I know I'm a little bit behind the release of it, but Jesse Enkamp put out a video a little while ago about how, like Jiu-Jitsu doesn't work or something like that. I'll give you guys the links and all that. All that goes to Substack, by the way. I don't put the links down in the comments or in the description anymore because apparently that hurts the algorithm. So you got to go to Substack for all of the in-video links. And but anyway, look, I get some shit from my karate friends, right? Because Jesse is maybe not always the most reliable source. He tends to sacrifice some truth and honesty, at least so it seems, for the sake of whatever narrative he's trying to spin, for the sake of making his video. And if that is indeed true, which does seem to be so, that's not a good thing. So always take Jesse with a grain of salt. It's not that he's not good at karate, it's just that he has a very particular way of doing business. And I don't know these things personally. These are just things that I've heard from people that I generally trust in these things. Anyway, Jesse made a video about, wondering if he could just stand up, just not engage, whatever, right? And long story short, right, he kind of proved his point that he could just make it work, right? And some people in the jiu-jitsu community just laughed and were like, in the end, he just proved jiu-jitsu worked because he wasn't using jiu-jitsu and blah, blah, blah. But Jesse actually made a really, really salient point, and this is something that we've talked about before. And that is the idea that when we look at the old world grappling, most grappling was what we would now call like takedown grappling, right? It was standing grappling and throwing the guy to the ground. Very, very little groundwork. And where you do see groundwork, it's usually quite rapid. Usually throws go directly into what you'd call a submission today, but generally speaking would either be an arresting hold or actual like joint or limb destruction, as well as, of course, chokes, strangles. And oftentimes what we would call pins now would be a chance for you to hold the guy down while you pull a weapon, or again, get into an arresting position. We don't see that preponderance of ground fighting like we do in jiu-jitsu and my grappling sport, catch wrestling. We don't see that groundwork showing up until the late 1800s, early 1900s. Generally speaking, people didn't start over specializing in that stuff until the turn of the 20th century, more or less. And that's because you start seeing this stuff being used more or less for sport. It's taken out of the military context, it's taken out of the self-defense context, and put into the folk festival context. And even if you look at the old folk festivals, most of that stuff, most of their grappling was based around takedowns, not generally pins, much less submissions. Now look, we know that submissions existed, we know that submissions existed in Greek grappling, both in pancration, and I am forgetting the name of the Greek sub-categorization of grappling. But, and you would signal defeat by raising a finger, kind of the version of tapping out or saying uncle or whatever. And that's all well and good. But the point that Jesse made, and a point that I think is worth reiterating and commenting on, is the fact that we should understand the context in which these arts were developed, and we should understand how they've changed and adapted over the years. And that's not to say that sticking only to the historical platform is necessarily the right way to do it, only that is where this stuff comes from. And sometimes things that look or feel or behave a certain way do so because the context that we experience them in is completely different than the context that they were conceived in. Look at the difference between Olympic fencing and actual historical fencing. Best we can do with the reconstructions in HEMA. Very, very, very different beasts, even though they share the similarity of holding a sword and trying to poke the other guy. There are some serious, serious differences in strategy, tactics, end results, and even techniques. And we see the same thing with grappling. Grappling has evolved because the context has changed. We're not fighting in arms and armor anymore. We're not necessarily sharing roadways with livestock. We're not as plagued by bandits. Physical violence, despite what people like to say and everything, for the most part, physical violence has been trending downward over the decades that I've been alive. We had a slight uptick kind of during pandemic time and all that. And there may be some reasons for that, but on the whole, it hasn't risen to, pre-my lifetime levels yet, which means that we're still in that downward trend versus the violence that these arts were developed in. And so the context just has shifted completely. Some of you may have seen the video. This was going fairly viral in martial arts communities around. It was just like a little short clip of different fighters and everything in mixed martial arts. And it's Jiu-Jitsu is fake. You can just stand up, and then showing different competitors like Crazy Horse is one that I can think of off the top of my head. Just standing up while somebody was laying on top of them. And this has happened multiple times, right? And we know for a fact that as soon as you add striking, it changes how grappling works, right? Even if you look at the difference between combat jiu-jitsu, which only allows slapping on the ground, versus regular jiu-jitsu, the game completely changes. As soon as striking is involved, what works and what strategies make sense do change. And the same is true for striking. What works in boxing and pure kickboxing change as soon as you allow clinching, takedowns, or the mixed martial arts game, which there are competitions for all of those levels of things. And so when you take something out and isolate it, it behaves completely differently than it does when it's in the full live mix of things. And that's an important point to remember, and this is why, I often will say, like, look, especially for grapplers, I mean, you can say this for strikers too, but I feel like strikers are actually facing more immediate threat than grapplers are, because grappling is easier to do safely than striking is, unless you want to count things like point sparring, which I don't. But grappling is just easier to do safely and still kind of keep its essence. And so when, grappling's like, we went to war. No, you didn't, right? And, and the fact is that grappling only competition is not a fight. And you could honestly say the same thing about striking competition. Striking is too isolated, especially boxing, to be a fight. And I love this stuff, right? I love catch wrestling, and I love boxing, and I love kickboxing. I love traditional martial arts. Like I am a student of the martial arts, but the fact remains that when you isolate things, they lose some of that essence of actually being a fight. Some people will even argue that MMA is not a real fight because of the stakes and everything. I think that starts skirting the edge of what you would consider a fight or not. But truth be told, right, a grappling match, even a submission grappling, even a submission only, no points grappling match, is not really a fight. It's just a match. It's just a sports match. And like I said, you could say the same thing in boxing and kickboxing, for sure. I do think MMA changes it just a little bit, but that's debatable, right? I'm not hardline on that. But it's just something to consider, right? We know that these things behave differently in isolation than they do in the full mix. And we know that they behave differently in the modern context than they did in the historical context. And that's not to say good or bad or anything like that. It's just to say, like, different is different. And you have to at the very least, understand why those differences occur and how those changes need to be made if you change the context, right? And that really is what this entire thing is about. It's what Jesse's video was about, really. And that's what I'm talking about here, is this is context dependent. If you strip something away and you isolate its principles and everything, and you strip something down to just like its own isolated attributes, you start really losing a lot of what made it go in the first place, and it starts becoming a completely different beast. So really, that's all I've got to say. But keep in mind, right, it's like, Sean Strickland came out recently saying, and he's got a black belt jiu-jitsu. He's like, yeah, jiu-jitsu's fake, right? It doesn't work. And like, that's clearly not true. But what it really comes down to is that we do see that now that people understand grappling isn't quite as dominant as we thought. I've gone over statistics multiple times, but even during the grappling dominant days, right, back in the 90s when all this stuff kicked off with the UFC, the early UFCs, striking was actually beating grappling. Now, grapplers were beating strikers, but striking itself as a tactic was beating grappling on average. And that continues to this day. Striking is still beating grappling. And it's because in the full fight, this stuff works differently than it does in isolation. Striking in itself is much more immediately disruptive, right? Grappling is disruptive in its own right. Grappling ties you up in ways that restricts your ability to effectively move with strength and power. Restricts your ability to generate force in a way that would create, concussive impacts. And that's fair enough, right? And of course, right, a lot of these traditional submissions done correctly are absolutely, tearing tissues, breaking bones, rendering you unconscious in seconds. And none of that's to be trifled with. That's all legit stuff. But that's not to say that striking doesn't work, because clearly it does, because that's what's actually winning fights. So with that in mind, right, it is context. And when you isolate things out of context, you change them fundamentally. So I'm starting to repeat myself, so I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.